Thank you, Wesley. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Renee Jenkins, a member of the Child Health Advisory Council, and we're pleased to bring you the second Pediatric Insight webinar focused on leadership and the pursuit of racial equity with a focus on research. I'll share the learning objectives with you. Then Dr. Tiffani Johnson, our first guest presenter, will do a presentation. She gave a dynamic presentation in session 1, and I hope that you all who weren't there have a chance to pull it up. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine, and is a thought leader on race and racism and its impact on child health and well-being. She serves on a number of national committees addressing race and racism, including co-chairing the Disparities Working Group of PECARN, the Pediatric Emergency Care Applied Research Network. Her focus will be making equity a strategic priority in research. She will be joined by our second guest presenter, Dr. Fred Rivara. Dr. Rivara is the Seattle Children's Guild Association Endowed Chair in Pediatrics. He's also Vice Chair and Professor of Pediatrics and an Adjunct Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Washington. He directs the Firearm Injury and Policy Research Program at the University of Washington, having received many awards for his work in injury prevention and control. He also brings his experience as editor-in-chief of the JAMA Network Open to us, in addition to his expertise as a mentor to aspiring researchers. He'll speak to us today on advancing research careers for women and underrepresented in medicine fellows and faculty. Slide. These are continue to be our learning objectives. Describing the opportunities for leaders to create a safer and more nurturing environment for diverse faculty, trainees, students, patients, and their families. We hope that the presentations will create a bi-directional dialogue following, looking at what some of the strategies are that are useful and have been tried to mitigate racism, especially in research. And then to identify additional resources, which Sarah told you are available on the website of Career Physician. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can I get a thumbs up if you guys can see my presentation in the appropriate view? Perfect. All right, so during the last presentation, I described some of the disparities that exist in pediatric healthcare and outcomes, and I use a social ecological framework to review some of the root causes of these disparities with a focus on racism. So today I'm going to build on that framework and discuss how we can use research as a tool for addressing inequities that prevent some children from achieving their highest level of health and well-being. I want to start by just briefly highlighting the historical perspective of racism in medicine. So in a recent JAMA article titled Recalibrating the Use of Race in Medicine and Research, the authors recount some of medicine's sordid history related to race. So this includes race being originally introduced in the US medical curricula in 1790 by Benjamin Rush, who asserted that Blackness was a particular kind of leprosy. Then in 1857, you have slaves who were characterized as a biologically appropriate phenotype for hard labor under trying conditions. And then in the 1870s, we saw racial exclusion in general society that reinforced medical segregation as well. And today we continue to see segregation in care by insurance status, which is very deeply entangled with race due to structural racism in the US. So these are just a few examples of the ways in which the history of medicine was built on a foundation of white supremacy that can't be ignored. And I can go on and on. I can talk about Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and the experimentation on Black and brown bodies. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that in modern times, there are a number of ways in which research continues to perpetuate racism and uphold structures of white supremacy. So on one hand, there have been some examples of excluding racially diverse and marginalized groups in clinical trials and in research. And then on the other hand, there have also been examples of exploiting racially diverse groups in research, such as the overrepresentation of Black participants in trials that don't require informed consent. And then for over a decade, we've also seen evidence of disparities in funding Black investigators with little action to close this funding gap. And when we think about our scientific journals, scholars have also reported biased critiques about the rigor of health disparities research and its validity as science. And at the same time, we've also seen the publication of studies that perpetuate stereotypes and discrimination and falsely assert race as a biological construct instead of recognizing it as a social construct. So let's take a deeper dive into some of these modern manifestations of racism in research. And let's start with NIH funding disparities. So a decade ago, research demonstrated that there was a significant funding gap at the NIH, revealing award probability for Black PIs, which are depicted in blue here. It was about 55% of white PIs, which are depicted in purple, of similar academic achievement. When considering the intersectionality of race and gender, further research has also shown that Black women face even greater challenges when getting NIH funded, as depicted in this figure. So for white investigators who are on the far right of this figure, we see that they are just as likely as their white male counterparts to receive NIH funding. However, when you look at Black investigators, we see that Black women are less likely than Black men to receive an R1 award. So fast forward 10 years from that original publication looking at disparities in NIH funding, and we see that these gaps still persist. And now we're seeing some greater insights into what some of the drivers are of these funding gaps. So this figure demonstrates that the lower disparities, that the disparities in comparison of Black investigators to white investigators, it depends in lower submission rates. So we have our Black applicants are at the top of the slide in red, and your white applicants are at the bottom of the slide in blue. And you see that there's overall a gap in who's submitting applications. And they found that career stage and institutional resources influence this gap in the number of submissions from Black investigators in comparison to white investigators. Next, when you look at this next portion of the funnel where we see some of the disparities coming out, they found that applications from Black investigators are less likely to be discussed, and they also have lower impact scores. So these three factors combined, submission rate, discussion rate, and lower impact scores, result overall in applicants from Black investigators being funded at half the rate of white investigators. One interesting new finding from this analysis was looking at topic choice. So they found that 21% of the funding gap between Black and white researchers was due to the research topic, with many Black investigators studying disparities research. And this is a topic that's less likely to be accepted and less likely to excite enthusiasm in the scientific community. And this may partially be explained by the era that we live in, where you have omics and precision medicine and artificial intelligence. So addressing disparities doesn't seem quite as innovative and results in less impact scores. But another interesting and notable finding from this study is that when you look at white scientists who propose research on health disparities, they were also less likely to get their research funded in comparison to research on other topics. So 13% for white investigators studying disparities versus 24% for white investigators studying other topics. But the white researchers still remain nearly 2 times more likely to have their disparities research funded in comparison to Black researchers, at a rate of 13% for whites versus 7% for Black investigators. Another important finding for this study was that the funding inequities exist despite scientific achievements such as NIH funding, funded training, previous grants, publications, or citations. And I think that's important to note when we think about solutions. The solution isn't telling people to write better. The solution isn't telling people to be more productive and have more achievements. The solution is to address the bias that's within the system. And so this article was published in Cell recently, and it's just very striking the way that they have graphically depicted these NIH funding disparities. So on the left of the slide, you see kind of the current state of affairs, where we see Black investigators literally being pushed off the cliff and being pushed out of academic medicine due to the bias that exists in NIH scoring and funding process. And they propose some strategies for equity that would help result in anti-racist reviews, equity policies that ultimately advance science overall through greater innovation and greater creativity. And so we'll talk about these a little bit when we get to the solutions. But before we move to these recommendations, next I just want to highlight some of the ways in which we see structural racism that's being upheld through our medical journals. So when we think about the context of the national reckoning regarding racism that was sparked by the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, and all of the ensuing protests, many academic organizations, maybe even some of your own for those who are on this call, as well as many academic journals have issued statements acknowledging their role in upholding structural racism. So for example, Cell published this statement. We are the editors of a scientific journal committed to publishing and disseminating exciting work across the biological sciences. We are 13 scientists. Not one of us is Black. Underrepresentation of Black scientists goes beyond our team to our authors, reviewers, and advisory board, and we are not alone. It's easy to divert blame, to point out that the journal is a reflection of the scientific establishment, to quote statistics, but it is this epidemic of denial of the integral role that each and every member of our society plays in supporting the status quo by failing to actively fight it that has allowed overt and systemic racism to flourish, crippling the lives and livelihoods of Black Americans, including Black scientists. Similarly, in a recent commentary, the Journal of Academic Pediatrics also noted that the composition of their editorial board does not align with their strategic values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So of the 24 members of their editorial board, they note that only 2 are underrepresented in medicine. And of their 15 editors, again, only 2 are underrepresented in medicine. In addition, in examining the content of their publications, they also acknowledge that the journal has not systematically invested in initiatives to advance science in the areas of equity or disparities. And just a week ago, the New York Times published an article focused on critiques that medical journals have been blind to racism as a healthcare crisis. So Dr. Raymond Givens, who is a Black cardiologist at Columbia, is featured heavily in this article, and he's also been in a couple of other publications because he's also been looking at diversity of some of the leading medical journal editorial staff. And so he found that of 51 editors at the New England Journal of Medicine, 1 was Black and 1 was Latinx. And of the 49 editors of JAMA, he reported that only 2 were Black and 2 were Latinx. And he, in his report, he also noted with humor, but with sincerity, that there were more editors named David at these journals than Black and Latinx editors combined. And in this New York Times article, they also highlighted how Black and Latinx scientists have experience of journals editing, the journal editors removing the word racism from their manuscripts and having their discussions whitewashed and watered down before ultimately actually rejecting the papers. And so as a result of these experiences, many investigators report just giving up on even trying to submit their scholarship to certain journals. And I can't really talk about racism in medical journals without mentioning the elephant in the room, where JAMA recently began receiving a great deal of scrutiny after a podcast discussion that was led by Dr. Edward Livingston, who at the time was an editor of the journal. And so in this podcast, he suggested that racism should just be taken out of the conversation about societal inequities because it makes good white people feel uncomfortable in those discussions. And in a tweet promoting the podcast that was tweeted out by JAMA, the tweet read, "No physician is racist. So how can there be structural racism in healthcare? An explanation of ideas by doctors for doctors in this user-friendly podcast." This podcast and the tweet that ensued because of resulted in a petition with more than 9,000 people signing it, demanding changes at JAMA, as well as in academic medicine overall. And so while this JAMA event has helped bring increased attention to this issue, such as articles highlighted in the New York Times, I want to emphasize that JAMA isn't the problem. It's a problem that's systemic in academic medicine that needs to be urgently addressed across all of our journals, across NIH and all of our funding agencies, as well as across all of the institutions for everyone who's represented on this call. So now let's move forward with some recommendations as we think about potential solutions for how to address racial equity in research. So I really like this definition of racial and ethnic equity in research, which means applying tools and practices needed to recognize people of color's experiences with unequal power and differential access to services and opportunity, while also considering historic and current lived realities, including structural racism. And so I want you guys to think about this definition as you think about the ways in which you can apply a racial and ethnic equity lens to your research. So I started off by talking about some of the disparities in NIH funding. So as we think about recommendations, here are some proposed recommendations for the NIH. So while professional development from faculty from underrepresented backgrounds and those studying disparities is important, I think it's also really time that we reframe the problem. So again, we can't just tell investigators, you need to write better and you need to publish more, assuming a deficit in the investigators that has been proven to be untrue. But instead, efforts need to be directed towards fixing the system that has proven to be biased in many ways and uphold structural racism. So how do we do that? So first, we need a more diverse applicant pool. And I know that Dr. Rivara is going to talk in his presentation about some strategies for how we can increase diversity in the applicant pool by supporting fellows and faculty trainees. We also need to recognize that until the NIH funding disparity is eliminated, all applicants for Black PIs must be discussed. Again, when we think about that funnel that I presented to you, one of the major gaps, it starts with the applicant pool and who's submitting grants, but next it's related to who gets discussed. So if we're funding more applications from Black investigators, then we will likely end up funding more applications from Black investigators. Recognizing that many of these disparities are also tied to topic choice, we also need to increase dedicated funding towards research that's focused on health disparities. So next, another recommendation is that the NIH should establish a policy for Black investigators across all career stages, similar to the early stage investigator or ESI program. So this ESI program was established in the NIH because it recognized and understood that helping professors establish a funding track record early in their career would be better for the entire scientific enterprise. And this need certainly exists for investigators who are underrepresented in medicine and underrepresented in the NIH funding portfolio. And then if we want to increase scores, we also need to make sure that we are making the diversity of the investigator team a scorable criteria in the NIH grant review and a priority for funding. And then finally, there's also a need to diversify the pool of peer reviewers by both race and ethnicity, as well as by including more disparities content expertise. So at present, only 2.4% of the pool of NIH peer reviewers are Black. And so given the disparities that we see in this NIH funding, we may really need to just reimagine and redefine scientific excellence as we identify who our peer reviewers are and think about other things like engagement with professional organizations or even public influence in the community related to research and service. So next, let's think about some recommendations for our journals as journals work towards anti-racism in the work that they're doing. I think some of the data that I presented to you helps highlight the critical need to diversify editorial boards, and we also need to diversify the reviewers. There also have been studies looking at the dearth of research published in the top medical journals with primary research beyond commentaries that have increased recently, looking at disparities and looking at racism in medicine. And so one of the ways that this could be addressed is through calls for papers focused on disparities research. I think it's also important that we provide guidelines on examining racism as a cause of health inequity among racial ethnic groups that journals can provide, and also using experienced reviewers who understand disparities research and how racism impacts health. So next, as we move beyond the NIH and beyond our journal editors, what can you, the individuals who are on this call, who are leaders in pediatrics and in our academic organizations, what can you do to help promote equity in research? And so the reality is that many of you are serving as gatekeepers in every step of the pathway, whether it's related to funding, publishing, or advancing research focused on racism and equity, as well as the professional success of Black scholars through the tenure and promotion process. So some of the steps that you can take are, if you're sitting on an NIH review panel, score Black faculty well, rescue Black grants by Black faculty to ensure that they're discussed, highlighting the innovation that comes from diversity of the investigator team. You can also, until the NIH starts making explicit criteria about this, you can consider diversity when you're scoring the investigator team and the innovation. And also, we recognize that many times inappropriate comments and racist statements are said that we're often silent to. So when you're sitting in these review panels, you can step up and call out and stop racist statements and comments whenever they're made in review panels. Other things that you can do as individuals is you can collaborate with Black faculty members. You can write papers with them, you can write grants with them and help promote their career development. And you can also, beyond just Black faculty members, collaborate with individuals who are doing disparities research from a multitude of racial and ethnic backgrounds. And I think one of the most important things that you can do is you can read, you can listen, and you can learn about structural racism in an effort to minimize bias in the review process when you're reviewing grants, when you're reviewing manuscripts. You can also take a racial justice lens when it comes to your own research that you're conducting. So most research topics can and should be viewed with a racial equity lens. So some of the questions that I would challenge you to ask yourselves are, broadly, in what ways can your current research be expanded to incorporate issues of racial and social justice? You can also ask, how has the previous research in your area considered or not considered race, and more specifically racism? And when addressing inequities, how can you be sure to avoid and reinforcing problematic stereotypes and focus on identifying root causes beyond blaming patients for the disparities that exist? I also can't emphasize enough how important it is to not exploit Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities when you're advancing your academic careers as researchers. So therefore, it's important to engage with the members of the targeted communities to ensure that the research that you're doing is really benefiting them in a meaningful way. The other things that you can think about doing when pursuing health disparities angle for your current line of research is building collaborations with experts who are in the field. And it's important that you never just come to your colleagues just asking to pick their brains, soliciting uncompensated labor, but instead you can really build true collaborations and appropriately compensate their time and their efforts. I also just want to quickly highlight that I'm doing some work with PCARN, the Pediatric Emergency Care Applied Research Network, and we've developed a disparities working group that is seeking to help make equity a strategic priority within our network, with a vision that PCARN will be a leader in advancing health equity and workforce diversity through rigorous, high priority, multi-institutional research that's focused on reducing avoidable disparities and ensuring that all children can achieve their highest level of health and well-being. So our current work group activities include developing a set of core data elements so that all projects coming through PCARN can have some sub-analysis to look at race and racism and how it impacts outcomes. We're also working on developing a pediatric emergency care disparities research agenda. And we're also developing some language for all of the subcommittees that review protocols coming through to ensure that those protocols are being reviewed with an equity lens, looking at things like diversity of the research team, as well as addressing potential disparities in their research topics. And then finally, I want to leave some recommendations for institutions. So at the institutional level, we really need to increase capacity for everyone to understand how to do research on this topic. So we need to make sure that education and training programs like T32 training programs, for example, are focused on addressing disparities in equity in research with rigorous methods. I will also encourage you, I know we have a lot of department chairs on the phone, so I want you to re-examine your organization mission, vision, and value statement and ask how it can more explicitly focus on diversity, inclusion, equity, and anti-racism. And then beyond just the mission statements, how can you align your organization's goals, resources, inputs, and activities with these values? You can also show supportive research focused on racial disparities and equity by inviting grant round speakers on these topics, as well as when you are evaluating your faculty and providing incentives and doing tenure and promotion, you can look at whether or not individuals are focused on promoting equity and diversity in those pathways. Another important thing that you can do is invest in funding for research focused on racial disparities and equity, including pilot funds and bridge funds, as well as thinking about awards for research that promote racial justice and equity. And also think about recalibrating the appointment and promotion committee's recommendations, given that we know that there are these disparities in NIH funding and that R01 funding is kind of the corner of the realm for academic promotion. So thank you so much for listening to my thoughts about some of the literature that exists on the different ways in which racism continues to be upheld within our funding process and within the publication process. Remembering that our goal is to really engage in a bi-directional dialogue. So we really want to hear about what you're doing in your research programs and what you're doing in your institutions, what's working well, what your challenges have been. And in order to really jumpstart this conversation, I'm going to pass the mic to Fred Rivara, who's going to share his insights on how to advance research careers for women and underrepresented minorities in medicine.
Thanks very much. A couple of things before I start. Renee mentioned that I'm editor-in-chief at JAMA Network Open, which is one of the 12 JAMA specialty journals. I was editor of JAMA Pediatrics for 17 years. So the issues that Tiffani mentioned about JAMA, I've been dealing with fairly nonstop for the last few weeks. There were 2 editorials that came out last week. My journal is publishing an editorial tomorrow, which you can all read online. We also did have a call for papers back in August of 2020, calling for papers on systemic racism and effects on health. So it's something that we've tried to do. We've published over 100 articles in our 3-year existence on issues of racism. So it's something that we're really thinking about and trying to deal with. Secondly, it's nice to do this because to see some of my old friends on here, Valerie, Peter, Jim, and Bernard. It's good to see you on listening to this. And you can see from the title of my talk, I want to talk about how do we advance research careers for women and URIM. And I think Tiffani has given you some idea. She certainly laid out the problems. And just this morning, I'm sure most of you on the call get the NIH extramural news. So Mike Lauer this morning has an article in there where he showed the rates of grants to applications by women and URIM in the COVID year. And he showed that the grant applications for women were down. The ones for URIM were flat. So I think that we really do need to think about how can we help the careers of women as well as URIM. Next slide, please. So I am not a scholar like Tiffani is about racism, but I certainly have thought about it, read about it. We know that there's a long and really sorry history of systemic racism and sexism in medicine and academia. And it's made it very hard for URIM and women faculty to be successful. And we as leaders must provide the structure which those who have suffered from such policies in the past can now succeed. And I think we can do this by not only offering this for those 2 groups, women and URIM, but all faculty. And these structural changes along with mentorship in various forms are needed. Next slide. I don't think any of my ideas or things that you all haven't thought about. I may just be putting a little bit of words to them and showing you a little bit of what we've done successfully. Bruder Stapleton is on the call, and most of you know Bruder, longstanding chair at the Department of Pediatrics here at the University of Washington for 22 years, and many of these things were done under his guidance and leadership. So I'll talk about mentoring programs, writing programs so we can be successful in publishing, grantsmanship issues, teaching research skills during fellowship to make people successful as faculty, and what do we need to do to provide adequate support. Next slide. So the first is mentoring, and I personally think this is probably the key thing for people to be successful. As vice chair of my department, I sit on our promotions committee, and anybody who has trouble with promotions, there's always a history of them not having adequate mentorship. Whether they weren't given those mentors, whether they didn't find them, whether they didn't use them, but it always comes down to poor mentoring. And I really believe, and Bruder and I really tried to do this, is that we have to require people to have a mentoring team. And we have to have them use it, and we have to regularly report on their activities. For our new faculty, we have a 90-day check-in after they've been hired. And at that check-in, they have to tell us who are their mentors. And then on their annual progress reports, they have to report, when did you meet with your mentors? How often did you meet with your mentors? Who is your scholarly oversight committee? So we not only have to say you have to have mentors, but we have to make sure that they indeed are having mentors and that they are indeed using them. We also need to provide guidance and guidelines for both the mentees and the mentors and how to adequately mentor. I think a lot of us do it now because we've done it for a long time and probably over time have gotten good at it. But there are ways to help people. I think in all of medicine, we believe that people can learn and they can be taught how to do things well. And so on our website, for example, we have guidelines for both the mentees and the mentors. We have mentoring contracts that people can use as templates for developing those between the mentors and mentees. And when we encourage our faculty to go out and find mentors, we have to encourage them to be expansive in thinking about it. The worst thing you want is for somebody to sort of stick just with the mentees and the mentors in their own division. That's way too limiting. Like Tiffani is a emergency medicine physician at UC Davis. I'm sure she takes advantage not only of the mentors available in pediatric emergency medicine, but those under Renee Cooperman and the whole department, if not the whole university. And I think we really have to encourage people to take advantage of these larger communities that are out there and seek the mentorship and be creative about who really is going to help you in your career. We all know it's not just one mentor. There's a number of different kinds of mentors that you need. I run a T32 program, and I insist that people have both a content mentor who knows the area of research interest, as well as a methods mentor, somebody who can provide them with the methodological expertise to be successful in their research. We also want to require all fellows and postdocs to have an individual development plan, something that formally lays out, here's what they're going to do, here's what they've done, here's what they've accomplished. So we can actually look at that and check it and monitor that they are actually making progress. Next slide. So what should mentors be doing? They have to guide a person's career and ensure it's on track. Again, every time that we see a problem at our promotions committee, it's because the person did not get adequate mentorship, did not have help to keep their career on track. Mentors need to be tough. It's tough love. They need to be like a parent. You don't give your kid everything they want. You don't say, great job. You don't get a trophy every time they do something. You have to sort of be kind, but you have to be critical. And if, the worst thing you can do with a fellow is to say, oh, that project is good, when it isn't. If it's like on a topic that's been researched a zillion times, then they should look for something else and don't say, well, that's been done before, but I'm sure you can do a good job. You need to tell them no. You need to find something else. You're doing them a favor by being tough. And as Tiffani mentioned, we need to create opportunities for people. We shouldn't be including them on grants. It's really hard for a faculty scientist to generate 80% of their salary on grants, in which they're PIs. They need to be PI in some grants, but they also need to be co-investigator in other grants. We should be encouraging those senior people in the room here to include these younger faculty members and fellows on our editorials, on our opinion pieces. One of the things we should do is, Tiffani mentioned, we have to have people that are URIM doing reviews of papers and grants. Well, the way to start is for them to be reviewing those with you, to share that with you. And it's not you being lazy, it's really you doing a review, but also them doing the review, and then you sort of teach them, how do you do a good review? We have to help them get invitations to give grand rounds, visiting professors, and to build up their national reputation. We should nominate them for editorial boards, for different awards. I mean, Bruder and I know that, the way to have your faculty win awards is to nominate them. They sure are not going to win awards if they're not nominated for them. Nominate them to be on national committees. Nominate them to be on study sections. NIH has this kind of junior study section member, and it's really a very instructive way to become a study section member. Nominate them for membership in honorary societies, whether it be SPR, APS, or National Academy of Medicine, and nominate them for leadership positions. And we need to ensure that other mentors are used appropriately. I see this all the time. I had a paper yesterday that came from some authors were from China, some authors from the United States, and the English was pretty atrocious. So that made me feel like the people from the United States had not helped the people from China with that paper. They just put their names on it. we need to make sure that mentors do what they're supposed to be doing. Next slide. So how do we make people better writers? I'm an editor now. I've been an editor for now over 20 years. When I first started out in medicine and in my faculty position, I was the world's worst writer. My wife made fun of me. But I firmly believe that writing is a learned skill. And we need to help people learn that skill. We teach them how to do procedures in medicine. We need to teach them how to write. And you hold writing workshops, starting with fellows and postdocs as well as junior faculty. We're just finishing up a writing workshop that we have held in our department. The goal is to help individuals with relatively limited experience be successful writers for the medical literature and engage senior faculty. When we put out a call for this among our senior faculty, we had more than a dozen senior faculty, many of whom have editorial experience, volunteer for this workshop to be mentors in the workshop. Next slide. What we did was we have division chiefs nominate individuals for the writing workshop, knowing these are individuals who are engaged in scholarly work and are ready to write a paper. It's not meant for somebody who is in the first month of their fellowship, but somebody who's further along and who has data that they're ready to write up. Attendees should have a well-defined research question, have completed the process of data collection. And people need to be committed. We do this in 4 sessions over a period of about 8 weeks. Every 2 weeks have a session. And we insist that they be committed to attending all 4 sessions of the workshop. And then what we do is we divide up 2 to 3 or 4 learners together with 2 senior faculty. We say, all right, this week you're going to write the introduction. This week you're going to write the methods. This week you're going to write the results. This week you're going to write the discussion. And then the week before each group, we pass these around to each other and critique them. And then in the workshop, we talk about them. And at the end of the workshop, they have a good draft of a paper. Next slide. It shows you some of the feedback. Oops. Extremely useful. Gave me tremendous insight into my own scheduling and priorities. The course requires commitment and should be taken seriously as the faculty and peers spend their precious time on it. The workshop is rewarding because that is treated seriously. I want to do it again if space is available. So this is really very well received. We had our final session with my group yesterday, and they're all incredibly enthusiastic about it. So these things are things you can do in your department today. Next slide. Grant writing. So that's another thing that Tiffani really mentioned is how do we make people more competitive with their grants? Well, let's help them write better grants. First of all, we have to encourage people to apply for grants. Again, if you don't apply, you're not going to get funded. We should have grant writing courses. We just had one at our Seattle Children's Research Institute that some faculty put on, and it was extremely successful. People really felt that they learned a tremendous amount doing it. NIH has various week-long courses, whether it be NIMH or NIMHD. They have these week-long courses where they talk about what are the kinds of grants that we're looking for. Create a successful pool of grant applications that people can see for your institution. Put it behind your department, password protected wall, but having people share their successful K awards, their successful R21s, their successful R01s. So people can see this is how you write a grant. This is what goes into a successful application. Create an internal review process. Now, the applicants don't like this to some degree because that means they have to have the grant ready to be reviewed probably a month ahead of time, but it can pay off tremendous dividends. Western Psychiatric Institute at University of Pittsburgh has done this for many years, and as a result, they have the highest success rate at NIMH for grants. So it's work, but it can be very successful. Conduct mock study section reviews. We did this about a month ago at our place for an R1 application. We're doing it next week for a K award. So we have an individual actually provide their successful grant for people to look at, and then have people serve as reviewers, have people serve as the chair of the study section, and as the SRO. And these things, again, teach people an awful lot about what it means to have a grant and what it means when it goes to NIH to be reviewed. And then again, make sure mentors actually mentor. what that means when you're writing a grant is that mentor has to look at, half a dozen different drafts of the grant and not correct grammar, but really make substantive comments about the content of the grant. Next slide. Fellowship training programs. First of all, I think fellowships need to decide what do they want to produce. Is it community physicians, or is it academic faculty, or is it both? The training for those are going to be different. You don't have to train community physicians a whole lot in research skills. You need to train them in how to read the literature, but their training is really quite different than the training for a fellow who's going to be an academician. Who runs the fellowship programs? Are you picking the youngest person in a division who has time available? Or are you picking an individual who's going to provide the outstanding mentorship? I think all too often we pick the youngest person. And I think that's a huge mistake. Does the fellowship program provide true development of research skills and research trajectories? If you're a chair and you're trying to hire somebody and they say they want to be a faculty scientist, well, you're not going to hire a faculty scientist as one publication as a fellow. You're going to hire a faculty scientist as a track record of producing a number of papers. We have to provide them with that research training. Formal coursework, protected research time. Do we need to make the fellowship a year longer to give them adequate time to develop their research skills? They certainly do this in HEMOC, for example, where they may have fellowships that are 4, 5, 6 years long. Yet for many of our fellowships, we set up for the 3 years. Is that really the right thing to do? And then, as Tiffany mentioned, is there a high enough proportion of women and URIMs fellows in the program? Next slide. This is a paper published this January in my journal from the fellows at the people at Duke. And what's really interesting is that and what the y-axis is women and URIMs. They call it a little bit differently there, but it's URIMs. Women are severely underrepresented in adult cardiology, severely underrepresented. In adult interventional cardiology, I'm told there's about 4 women nationwide doing adult interventional cardiology. So this is a huge problem. So what happened was Duke decided they needed to fix their thing, and I'll show you what they did in a second. But you can see the results of their efforts. They went from about 20% women in URIMs to over 60% inside of 3 years. Next slide. And you can see, this is obviously a summary of the article. You can go to the article and read it. They created an environment that was committed to change. They changed the fellowship leadership. They had an institutional commitment. They collected data, including applicants who were highly ranked but didn't go to Duke. They created a diversity task force. They looked at and revised the whole applicant interview day, the applicant review process, and the applicant ranking process. And again, getting back a little bit to what Tiffany was saying. And then post-match interventions. They made sure that people had strong mentorship. They again got feedback from applicants that did not match. And then they tried to foster relationships with their best medical students and internal medicine residents to try to get them to go into cardiology. So, the previous slide shows this can be successful, but it requires some concerted effort and will to do it. Next slide. Again, as Tiffany mentioned this, we've got to provide adequate support. I think the first thing is to make sure faculty are on the right track. At our university, we have full-time clinical faculty, we have clinician educators, we have faculty scientists. We need to help people figure out which is the right track for them and not put them in the wrong track that they're going to fail in. Secondly, we have to provide them with startup funding. The K Award is, I know Valerie's on, May Holmes from NIH, but we all agree that K Award is kind of a crappy award. It provides the up to 75% of the individual's salary, but NICHD only provides $25,000 for research. That's not enough to really have your research career take off. We have to provide adequate startup funding for those individuals, and not just the bench scientists, but the people who do clinical and epidemiological research as well. We have to create small internal grant programs that people can apply for. And they can be small. They can be $5,000, $10,000, enough to hire a computer programmer or a research assistant so they can get a project done. We have to give them protected time. And this is paid protected time that makes research feasible and success likely. Another thing we found in our promotions committee that was kind of the death knell for some people was they were given big administrative responsibilities early in their faculty members' career. Oftentimes people are recruited because they have a particular clinical skill. I understand that. But that doesn't mean that you need to make them in charge of a clinical program right off the bat. They're coming from an outside institution. They're trying to get their research going, and then you make them head of a clinical program. They have to try to negotiate all the pathways in our Byzantine organizations. I mean, that really is a formula for failure. Next slide. Bruder and myself and others at the University of Washington, and Shaquita Bell is on from our institution, created a diversity committee among our residents. And Shaquita was one of the people that got this started. Created a diversity committee among our faculty. We've created an internal K program for URIM faculty so that we can provide them with that startup. Tiffani Johnson, who is our division chief in general pediatrics, recently got funded by Valerie with a T32 program that's focused on child health equity research program. So she is doing exactly what Tiffani suggested, which is let's train people to be great scientists and to do research on child health equity and health disparities. Next slide. We've created a small grant program for research on DEI. Shaquita is director of the Center for Diversity and Health Equity. Tiffani is has been the research director of that, and they've created a small grants program where people can get funded to do research in this topic. Minority supplements for NIH grants. I'd be interested in hearing from Valerie how many of those are actually applied for and received. But my sense is that that's kind of money that's there for the asking to help fund a junior faculty member. If you have an R01 grant that has 2 or 3 more years left, you can get that extra money to help fund a minority applicant to be part of your grant. Developing K clubs to help people be successful in their K awards. And then, of course, the pipeline. How do we get more people in the pipeline? Well, one of the ways to do it is to provide summer programs for high school and college students. I think we're all realized these got to be paid. We're really beyond the idea of having unpaid internships. These have to be paid programs where people can come in and gain some skills as well as make enough money to help them this next year in school. Next slide. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we have referred to Val any number of times, Fred. And I know she had planned to be on. I don't know if she's on, if she may want to comment now or just wait till we get into a more active
Valerie is on.
Okay.
Valerie,
So,
if you don't know, is the branch chief for acute care and trauma at NICHD.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you. These presentations were wonderful. I certainly can wait until we have the active discussion. I do have some comments to make, and I'm going to try to see if I can get some information that Fred mentioned on the diversity supplements. But so far, I think your comments are spot on, and I have some other comments to share that are from a little bit of a different perspective from my side of the table and what I see on this end. So I'll wait until the presentations are done, and then we'll weigh in as well.
okay. So we basically just do a few questions from the audience, and we start out with our own questions. And I think one of the first ones that I would love to hear people weigh in on is really understanding more about what does success really look like. I think Fred has offered some of the successes that he's experienced at UW. But I think we are still probably not exactly where we want to be in terms of consistent metrics about how we're doing in terms of making many more successful women and underrepresented minorities in medicine successful in their research careers. I certainly appreciate you talking about focusing on high school students and students in college, because if many young people don't really feel they have a skill set or are not invested in that level of interest in research careers, when they don't really have some models to really look at. And so I think that certainly is something that you underscored. And then the other issue around mentorship is trying to make sure there's not a minority tax associated with this mentorship, where the underrepresented in medicine minorities are paired with only with mentors that are minorities. They should have role models, but we can't sort of weigh down our underrepresented, more mid-career mentors with all of those young people. And so I think these are probably some of the responses that we could talk a little bit more about in terms of especially what success looks like.
And there was a nice article in New England Journal, I think it was last week, about minority tax, for those of you interested in reading it.
Mm-hmm. So what do we think that the success looks like? We have to have something in front of us that I think we have some consistency in agreement that these are the things we want to see happen. Fred, would you? I'm sorry.
Sorry, Renee, I was just going to say, I want to remind all our guests that if you have a comment or question, just raise your hand and I'm happy to unmute you and welcome our panelists to weigh in as well.
So Tiffani, did you want to respond at all to that?
So what does success look like from an institutional standpoint is the question, Dr. J?
Yes.
So I think we can measure success in a number of ways. One is, are you increasing in number, the number of underrepresented faculty who are in your institution who are doing research? And I think that Fred also highlighted a lot of important points around once you get them and once you recruit them, what are you doing to support their success and to retain them? And so I think that retention is another measure for what success looks like. When it comes to I think that there are traditional metrics of success in academic medicine that we've talked about, like related to journal publications and impact factor and grant funding. And given that we know that there's this well-documented literature on disparities in those areas, I do think that we need to be more creative in how do we measure the success of an investigator who's doing research that might be community engaged or focused on disparities, given the inequities that exist with these traditional metrics. And so I think that there are other ways that we can look at some of the impacts that individuals are having on their communities as well. So those are some of my initial thoughts about kind of how you define success. I think other things are, we talked, about community engagement. And so I think that is also a part of success. You are successful when you are empowering and improving outcomes in your communities. And so I think that looking at some of those metrics are also important when we think about, what makes us successful when we're supporting investigators in these areas.
Great, thank you.
Bruder just asked a question, can we support academic promotion? What are the criteria that encompasses research and racism and diversity? Well, it's a very apropos question because we actually just had a faculty vote on changes in our promotion criteria for what we call clinician scholars, other people call clinician educators. Boyd in a Carnegie report talked about the different kinds of scholarship. So it's scholarship of discovery, scholarship of integration, scholarship of education, but there's also scholarship of application. So, which I really think is scholarship of how do we apply what we know into different communities. And so we now have expanded our kind of definition of success, scholarly success, to include all of those aspects there. So I think we can think about looking at what are our promotion criteria, and are our promotion criteria really reflective of what faculty do? We want to be able to reward faculty for their activities. So we want faculty to aspire to excellence, but we also need to recognize what are the different areas of excellence that we're going to count.
And is there counting also for promotion criteria for being a mentor?
Yes. We really pay a lot of attention. We look at the traditional academic activities, clinical care, teaching, research, and administration. And mentoring is really an important part of teaching. And, how much mentoring do you do and what's your success of mentors? We pay a lot of attention to that. It's not only what how the residents rank you, when you're teaching on the ward, but how well do you mentor people? What have your mentors been able to accomplish?
I can add that at in the UC system, including UC Davis, where I am now, for your merits and promotion, you are required to submit a DEI statement to discuss your contributions to diversity and equity. I'm too new in the system to know how that's operationalized. So I'll give me another year when I go through the promotion process, and I'll let you know if it actually counts for anything. But I do think that it is at least a step in the right direction. That sends a message to faculty member that this is something that is important and it's an expectation in order for you to be considered, successful in the institution.
And our School of Medicine has recently required that as well. Bernard, you have a question?
I have a comment. I think I just want to emphasize regarding mentoring, there's a really important need to expand the networking of underrepresented in medicine residents, fellows, and faculty. And I think that's something leaders, research leaders, or other kinds of leaders can really do. We should be thinking about how to introduce them on the national stage, how to find mentors at other institutions as well as our own institution, and to make sure that they get featured at national meetings in a variety of ways.
Thank you.
I think that's an important point, Bernard, and it also highlights kind of some of the differences between just being a mentor and being a sponsor. And as I think I'm the most junior person on this panel, I have definitely benefited from having mentors who are also sponsoring me and creating opportunities for me, whether it's through PCARN and national organizations or through the American Academy of Pediatrics, or even people like Bernard who have invited me to be on commentaries and invited me to be on invited plenaries at the Academy that have help to kind of shine a light on my career. So not only mentors, but sponsors are really important to promote academic growth and development.
Great. Your hand is still up, Bernard. Do you want to say anything else?
He's just giving high fives now, I think.
Oh, it's a high five. Okay. I am so not into the.
No, I'm just kidding.
I like the idea though.
I'm going to make one other comment, which is about promotions committees. I'm on the NYU School of Medicine, a scholar, clinical scholar, scholars promotion committee. And I find that people are mostly not thinking about the harder road that a number of the underrepresented in medicine faculty who are up for promotion have gone down. And I think there needs to be sort of re-education or education of the mission of those committees, and maybe plant some advocates. They don't have to be underrepresented medicine faculty, really, but they have to be people who are thinking, how can I make sure that people see the strengths of this person? And now I'm going to take my hand down.
And I would say, so that goes for both the people who are on the appointment, tenure, and promotion committee, but also that's some good advice for letter writers who are writing letters of promotion for faculty. I'll throw that out there since, again, I'm going up for promotion next year. I don't know who's going to be writing my letters, but it's also
I don't think you're going to have a problem. Any additional comments around metrics? Dr. Strauss, do you want to make any comments? Pardon me?
Looks like Bruder has his hand raised.
Oh, okay. Go.
Yeah, that wasn't just a high five.
Okay.
But, I think, thank you, Bernard, for those great suggestions. I was thinking, I was on the promotion committee here. All the chairs are really kind of assigned to learn the process, and then participated as an advocate for our faculty. And I don't ever recall a member from the BIPOC community on the promotion committee.
Right.
And, you know, I think it also spills out into nominating committees and societies. And, you know, people of color need to be part of the process. And I think, you know, we have to demand that. And with our advocacy, I think it's possible.
I think you're right. We have no lack of recommendations related to these issues. Dr. Mahomes, do you want to comment now?
Yes, I have quite a few things to say, but I think I'll start with just the funding gap, in the NIH funding gap. Now, I can't speak on behalf of the NIH, so these are just my own. These are my own observations. One of the things that I noted, I can tell when an applicant has not been mentored when or if they call. So I'll talk about the when they call, and then I'll talk about the if in just a moment. Um, uh, the applicant often is calling on their own. You can tell when they have had the kind of coaching of a mentor or sponsor in the preparation for the call, the confidence in making the call, or even sending the email to set up the call, and the kind of sense of entitlement that, yes, I'm entitled to come. These are taxpayer dollars. You know, I can make a call to a program official and ask questions about the grant application process. So from where I sit, I can tell when an applicant has not had that kind of training and coaching and mentoring. And it shows in the questions, it shows in the follow-up. So that's where I get to the if they call. There oftentimes I do follow up with applicants, whether or not they are likely to get funding from NICHD or minority health or mental health. You know, for me, it doesn't matter. If an applicant, especially an early career investigator, calls me, I am going to set up multiple meetings, and I'm going to give homework to go back and read, you know, some of the Mike Lauer blogs, to go to the NIAID website to learn about the grant application process. Somebody mentioned about sample applications, which is a great idea. The website has sample applications on them. I, you know, show them how to go to the reporter and look for grants in their particular scientific area. And then let's come back and have a conversation about your project. Now, that's an awful lot. I know people are busy, you know, they're on service, but that's what it takes to be successful, to have the persistence to follow up prior to your application being submitted. Even if you know, are virtually rolling your eyes with this old lady talking about sample grant applications. You don't want to hear that. You just want to get right to your stuff. You don't want homework. You just want to get right to your stuff. You know, I encourage them to contact me again. When an application is not discussed, now we have no way of knowing what the race and ethnicity is of the applicant from the application. But I encourage applicants to use the biographical sketch section strategically to, you know, to indicate where they are trying to make a difference. What's the public health significance of their application in terms of the communities that they serve, and really make it clear what you're trying to do, so that the reviewers will know that this application is somewhat of a departure from what they might be accustomed to reading, but it's intentional, and that you've got you've assembled a team of folks that can help you achieve your goals. Let's say, for example, if this is a K award, or if it's an early career investigator who's trying to get their R01 for the first time. Oftentimes after the application isn't discussed, I might get questions back like, gee, they didn't like me, they didn't like my application, so should I scrap it and do something else? And so I spend a lot of time saying, you know, there's sometimes that's just formulaic and it has nothing to do with you. And sometimes it does have to do with the kinds of things that Fred mentioned in his talk about writing and grantsmanship. Grantsmanship is half the battle. So I would say that one of the things that I think these ideas that you all have put forward are really, really important. The mentoring, I just can't say that, emphasize how important that is enough on all levels. From some of the things that might seem, like minutia, it really is important and it pays off in the long run. So I personally invest a lot of time upfront, pre-application, and so that the applicants can take that information and those resources and run with it and try to be successful. So that would be one metric of success. How much time do you spend up front with applicants to ensure that they feel, number one, entitled to call back, and when they don't get their application discussed, that is when they should be calling back. And I spend a considerable amount of time. I actually enjoy it because it helps me to understand what the disconnect is between the reviewers and what the applicant is saying. Because if they don't discuss it, I don't know, what was the particular rub for that reviewer. But when I'm talking to the applicant, I can get a good sense of what they may have understated or underemphasized in the application, and can help them kind of think through how they might frame something differently or how they might apply more better grantsmanship skills to say, be more explicit about what they intend to do, what the specific outcomes are, and so forth. So, so that's on the applicant side. Can someone hear me?
Bernard, yeah, he's muted now. Okay.
Okay. On the mentoring side, NICHD doesn't use the K24 mechanism anymore, but mentoring is really important for the mentor as well, and to have that be valued and validated. So, Renee talked about the minority tax. A lot of underrepresented minorities might be overwhelmed with teaching responsibilities and all the mentoring and so forth, and they may not get credit, quote unquote, for it. And so other institutes use the K24 mechanism, which is a mid-career mentoring opportunity where you get time bought away to mentor. We place a value on it. So to the extent that, that makes sense for you and colleagues, encourage your mid-career and senior faculty to stay abreast of, the latest NIH policies, to apply for these kinds of funding mechanisms so that they can buy away time to be mentored. So success for me from where I sit would look like, kind of the full court press from both ends, the faculty member and the trainee and the fellow having the opportunity to be mentored, having some training which includes self-efficacy in it. I don't, that's a whole other workshop. But, internalized oppression is really something that is a big barrier, and we don't talk about that enough. And the imposter syndrome and all those kinds of things come into play, and that needs to be a part of that training as well. You are entitled to call. You are entitled to ask questions. You're entitled to come back in again and again and again until you get your grant. And oftentimes, I know there are reasons for it. I'm kind of talking from the 30,000 foot level, but oftentimes people stop right after the first, maybe second try. And it's easy to say, well, they didn't like my grant application. Well, maybe there's something that you did or didn't do. And maybe they didn't like it. I don't know. I won't know that until until we have that conversation. So that's my experience. And those are some things I don't get to talk about a lot when we're talking about, how to bridge this gap, how to reduce and eliminate disparities, that internal work, and that sense of self-efficacy in this space, not so much in the clinical practice space, but in this space that will help to kind of get over that big divide.
I'm
Well,
so
thank you.
glad that Dr. Mahomes is on the call because, I talked a lot about the importance of diversity and representation in the NIH reviewers, but we also need more Valeries as POs. She is definitely a champion of diversity in the NIH in terms of URM applicants, as well as a champion for equity research through my experience in both successful and unsuccessful applications that she has helped out with. And so we need, but diversity and representation matters. So we need more program officers at the NIH who are helping to provide this feedback and working with applicants, particularly junior applicants from underrepresented backgrounds, because all POs are not created equal.
Exactly. And there's a network of us who do the same thing. So one of the reasons that, as I said, I don't mind if someone is calling me and their application is a better fit for NIGMS or for heart, lung, and blood, I always start the conversation and do the introductions to the program official at the other institute. And then that way, it's a really nice handoff. So the applicant is not sitting and waiting for that other PO to call them, because we get hundreds of inquiries a day, and if you don't get to it today, it gets lost and you might not see it for a few more weeks. So when there's a handoff from another colleague, sometimes that gets addressed more quickly. So we often do that and copy each other, and I always follow up with that person that I recommended to someone else to see if they had their questions answered, even if it is a month later. Just to make sure that they haven't slipped through the cracks. And I have caught a number of applicants who just said, no, I didn't get my questions answered. I decided to do something else. And then, I call them back and say, what can we do to be helpful? And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, but at least they know that the outreach was there.
Well, I think you're incredibly generous with your time, and being in that position, you really are making it work for the young investigator. So I know it's got to be tremendously appreciated, as Tiffani has pointed out. So I think we are near the end of our time. And I had one more slide, but I think it's something that you can see on the stored presentations. Can you show that slide for a second? Okay. I think most of us are familiar with the series of American Pediatric Society articles on social justice. And this is just a sort of a summary slide that Tamara Coyne-Beasley did to basically say, where are the areas that we can make a difference in? And I think we've tried with this activity to really focus on realistic things that we can do or that we can recommend to others, and to listen to what the experiences have been of other colleagues who are working to really bring racial equity, racial justice to the process of clinical and to research. So with that, I certainly want to thank Dr. Johnson. She's been an incredible contribution, fantastic talk, and Fred for joining us in session 2. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your reflection and the what you've offered in your presentation. So without further ado, I think we are able to close down this webinar, and I thank everybody for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.